by default. To my right at the very end is Carrie McCord, the daughter of Loretta McCord, who is sitting next to me. And then in the center is Wesley, and this is his son Elliot. And Shauna, who is Mervyn, who's not present, is his daughter, and then Derek, also his son. And so to give you kind of the lineage, so you know, Loretta at this point is the eldest. Our eldest was Raymond, who passed away. Loretta's a better at date than I am, but passed away, and so Loretta is the eldest. Then next to the eldest is Dewey, who is not present, who lives in Everett, Washington, works for a Boeing Aircraft Company. And then there's I'm the middle child, and then Wesley follows behind me about 13 months later. And then Shauna and Derek's father, Mervyn, follows Wesley about 14 months later. And then our deceased younger brother, Wayne. So there were seven of us total. There's now 5. And I'm not sure, some of you I know I've seen before and kind of know the history of the Hee family and how we actually originated in Mendocino, but I would like to encourage you to ask questions. And the reason we brought our nieces and nephews here, even though they don't want to speak, I encourage you to ask them questions. Derek and Shauna had lived here when they were quite young for a year while Mervyn was a captain in the Fish and Game here. And Elliot grew up here, so Elliot actually is a native. He's the one, he was born in Mendocino up Little Lake Road, so you can ask him anything about basketball or baseball especially. And Wesley actually can give you a lot of information historically about the fishing and hunting around this area, because that's actually how we grew up, living off the land, and so I consider him an expert in this field. And then Loretta, well, I won't say how long, but anyway, as being the oldest of the sisters, she grew up in a different time period than I grew up and Wes grew up. And so I would say that she actually broke a lot of barriers for us in terms of coming from a family who basically was considered of mixed race. And so part of the history that we grew up, that our father kind of tried to shelter us from, was growing up in a town that looks really nice and amiable, but there were a lot of underlying racist comments that were given to us as children, and growing up with that, but also growing up with a temple that is bright red and green and was never painted any different, and knowing that you were always being reminded that you were different in the community versus mainstream society, and that being taught different customs. And I know for Wesley and Loretta that before we could really talk, we actually knew our family history, and that so when we were able to talk, we could recite it from memory. And so what you'll hear from us are really terms of what stories that we've gained from our father when he would sit down and talk with us. And actually, it's a good time for our nieces and nephews to learn about some of the history of the conversations that we had with our dad. But briefly, I'll tell you, is that the story is, and it's been verified by another family in Monterey, is that 7 sampans started out to California because they had heard about the California gold rush. And our great-grandfather and his brother were included in this group of men who decided they were going to come here and get rich. And it wasn't the intention of coming here and living here forever, just to come here to gain enough money to go back to China to be able to support their families there. Unfortunately, what we've discovered is our great-grandfather was a farmer, and so he didn't know anything about sailing, and kind of fits ironically with our father, who fished in the Pacific Ocean but never knew how to swim. And what happened is that the story is, with the help of some other collaborators, is that these farmers went to the Philippines to get quick sailing lessons, 1, 2, 3, in order to be able to sell those sampans over here. Only 2 of those sampans survived, and they originally were set out for the coast of Monterey because the Chinese were trading with the Native Americans long before the Spanish had discovered California. Well, 1 sampan survived and did land in Monterey, and they actually have pictures of that. But our great-grandfather got off course and went to the opposite end of the state and landed around Caspar Beach. And so what happens, when he landed here, he had no money, and he also didn't speak English. And so what he kind of did was just work wherever jobs were available. But at that time, the railroad industry was starting to boom. And so he just took jobs wherever he could get, and finally resided in Mendocino. The temple was built several years later because there was a large population to support a Taoist temple, which is down on Albion Street. And it was to support the Chinese community that was growing here. And I know that historically, in Dorothy and Beth's book, they don't say there were a lot of Chinese here, but in oral history that I had with my father over the years, he had said there were about 500 to 700 Chinese here in the 1870s. And Dorothy and Beth used to say to me, well, that's not really true. And I said, well, why is that? And they said, because of the census records. But going to graduate school and doing some research on Chinese American history because of what my thesis was about, I had done some research and realized, well, most of the Chinese, and even my great-grandfather was an illegal immigrant here. And so saying, well, you're not going to go up to the census bureau and say, hi, count me. You were going to stay hidden. And that's exactly what they did. And to verify that is that our grandfather, who is Ahi, who married our grandmother Yip Li, who actually is our father's mother, she was born here, and she was born on the property where the temple is, but our grandfather, Ahi, came in the time when it was illegal for any new Chinese immigrants to come into California, even into the United States. So in order for him to migrate here, he had paid someone to say that he was related to someone, because that's the only way a new Chinese person could come here. You could come here if you were already related to someone here. So he paid someone to say, I'm your son. So he was a paper son. And that's one of the reasons why our father was never really talkative about our family history to a lot of people outside of the family, and even to us to the day that we were in our 20s, because he always had the fear that we would be deported because he is not really our real name. And the only reason I knew that is in graduate school, when I was doing research and I discovered that in 1952 when I was born, that was when the law was lifted off the books that any Chinese person could marry a white person. Before that, it was illegal. And so when I discovered that, I had sat down and asked him a couple of questions. I said, I want to know, is he a real name? Because when I talked to other Chinese who were when I was in college and then in the Bay Area, they would always ask me where that name came from because it was so unusual. And he would always tell me, shh, we don't talk about that. And then I finally said, is that because he was a paper son? He paid someone to use the name, and he goes, yeah, that's why. And then I said, oh, and I said, you always told us that you went 2 states away to get married because you thought it was sort of romantic. They didn't tell us it was romantic, they just thought it was a nice thing to do. And I had asked him, I said, did you go out of state because you couldn't marry our mother here? And he goes, yes, that's the reason. So they got married in Washington State because that was legal for them to be married there. And they came back here, and by the time that law was lifted, they already had 4 children. So, and going back to the history, is that when the temple was built, it was a small structure, and most of you have been inside. There was another room added later in the 1870s because when the congregation was really large, they could afford to have a priest on the premises 24 hours a day. A traditional Taoist temple will always have a priest there. It's never locked, and they can come and go whenever they need to have advice from the priest or if they need to say an extra prayer. But most Chinese in the outlying areas and in here also had a small altar in their house as well. And still to this date, a lot of traditional Chinese will still have a small altar somewhere of their god, somewhere that they always make offerings to. And that the temple itself, the structure, is when they want to come and have the priest's blessing for a new son or for a death or a birth in the family. And then especially Chinese New Year's, there are special celebrations. And we don't have any pictures, and I'm sorry. But if you go inside the altar and on when you're standing there on your right, in the bottom corner, there's a white piece of paper there. And on that piece of paper is a prayer for a baby boy. So that belief of sons being really important in the family was still carried over to this temple to this day. And so that's part of the ceremony. And I can tell you a lot more, but I don't want to be the one that's talking all the time. I want other people here to be talking. But also, it's your opportunity to ask us questions about the temple and the history, but also about growing up here in the town of Mendocino and being from 2 different worlds, of being half Chinese and being half white, but when I explain that, because a lot of people look at us and say, oh, you don't look Asian, is because we're German and Irish as well. And so we have a different combination, kind of mixed up. And the nice thing, I don't know about Wes and Loretta, but it's interesting because when I went to college, I thought it was different. And then when I met a lot of Asian American students and they said, oh, you have a temple, I didn't think it was just ordinary. It was every day to me. And they're all looking at me a little strange. And I realized they didn't have that. So I was really lucky, but I also was really lucky to be able to grow up in two different worlds and to be able to pick the best of two different worlds. And so growing up here may have been hard, but in the end, I think I had a better aspect and lookout on life because I got a chance to really taste two worlds. And as we all knew, not only were we taught a little bit of the Taoist religion, but Wesley and Loretta didn't so much, but I got a taste of Catholicism, and they got a real smattering of Southern Baptists. So we have had a real taste of fire and brimstone to self-indulgence. So anyway, I just want to open it up to them if they'll talk, but I have a feeling you're going to have to ask questions in regards to that, okay? So go to it. Are there any questions at this point?
Did
Yes.
you guys have any connections with the Fort Bragg Chinese or anything? Like Benji Wong and those guys? Was there any?
That was in the later years. The only connection, and Loretta would probably be able to speak to that, is that our father knew them, but not really communicative. And Fort Bragg historically never really allowed the Chinese before that into Fort Bragg. If anything, the Chinese were not permitted to enter Fort Bragg, and they were treated as, like the Native Americans up there, unacceptable, and were not allowed to actually stay in the city limits. And the gentleman that was in Fort Bragg, I don't know a lot about. I just remember as a child going to, what is it? What's my name now?
The Windsor Hotel.
Yeah, that my father sort of indirectly knew the cooks there and would make a weekly trip there to have lunch and also to chat with them. But most of the Chinese here historically, as I remember as a kid, didn't really communicate really closely except for my father and his brother Charlie, who would come down on Fridays and have dinner with us, because I think that their whole purpose was to stay really low-key and not bring notice upon themselves. And supposedly that was supposed to be the same way with us, is that we weren't supposed to bring notice to ourselves so that we could just kind of be lost in the community and not stir up any bad feelings at this point.
I have a question. When you mentioned the sampans coming over, and I've seen pictures of China and of Hong Kong with sampans, were they much, much larger than that? Or in research, have you found out anything about the boats themselves?
No,
How they
we
made the
don't.
trip?
I remember, and it wasn't a junk, it was in some small history book, and I can't find it locally, and I think it was Mr. Hyman, who actually has a picture of a sampan in oil.
That came across?
Yeah.
Are they the same as a junk? and
No, a
sampan
junk
the
is
same?
larger. A junk is
A
much,
junk
much
is-
larger. And they actually still use those a lot in Hong Kong. We saw several of them.
So, your dad didn't sail all by himself across here?
Our great-grandfather.
Your great-grandfather, he didn't sail all by himself?
No, his brother was with him, and about 10 years ago, we actually got to finally meet our father's brother's side of the family, the Lees, and I'm actually in contact. We're considered cousins. Our real cousin's 75 years old, but I'm in contact with his daughter, which I guess is my second cousin or whatever. It's interesting, and they always heard about the story, but her dad didn't know if it was really true or not, and then when we connected, thank goodness for the internet, that he said, now I know the story's true, because it was a story that was handed down to him, but he couldn't really verify it.
Oh, okay, so they're.
And what was his name?
Edwin,
Edwin.
yeah.
You said he is kind of a paper name.
Yes,
Have you found out what
no,
the official name is?
no. He probably has a whole nother family. Can I ask hers and then, okay.
You said there was a Taoist priest here. Were they a Lu holding Taoist priest, or were they a Fasher?
I have no idea.
How long about were they here?
They were only, as far as we know, he was here in the 1870s, but there's no documentation of when he left. There is, I heard, when we went for state landmark status for the temple years back, the historians that came to verify the building in terms of the date that we were saying, you know, dates back to, had said when they did some research in the archives in Sacramento, the state of California, they said they found an article, which I've never been able to come across, that the priest marries a local girl. And so they were asking us if that was possibly our grandfather, and I couldn't tell him. But when I went to go do some research, I never could find that article.
Do you know if they held a jiao anytime to consecrate the temple?
Yes,
When
they
was
did.
that?
The temple where it's built wasn't just built because that was a great spot to build it. It was plotted specifically because of, it has to do with the Taoist religion and the feng shui. So it was selected, that spot was specifically selected because it was in harmony with the wind and the water. And the gravesite that is up, the many names that the county cemetery has across the Catholic Church, one of it's the Chinese cemetery, that specifically gravesite was plotted by a priest as well. Our grandmother had the priest plot saying, okay, if the family needs to be buried, this is where they will be buried to be in balance.
But you don't really have any more documentation of
No.
the priest?
No. Yes, Kevin.
I was wondering if there's some cool special stories that Edwin Lee it was and your great-grandfather and brother told about surviving the voyage.
Ed doesn't really, when I talk to Denise, because that's kind of how I talk, he was the youngest. He had 4 sisters who are the eldest, and they never really told him a lot. He was pretty protected. And the other, his sisters have not really passed on his stories. One of them has already passed away. One of them I just found out has a serious stroke. So I'm going to try to make a consecrated effort to see if I can videotape and see if I can get them to open up. And it's going to be kind of iffy for these ladies. And so that's the next mission, to see if they will talk.
It seems like it would take an enormous amount of courage if you really were a farmer by nature. You know, be like 8 of us saying, let's try to train to sail and get on a small boat and try to find the Philippines from here. That's pretty phenomenal.
I think if you're starving and you're hungry enough that you'll do anything to make your life better, and I think that was the drive. That was the drive of thinking they were going to become rich. Yes?
I used to live in Albion 30-some years ago, and that's when I first visited the temple, and the gentleman there opened the door for us and let us in. And how does he relate to you? Who was living
It
in there?
had to be our father.
That's what I
Yeah.
wanted to show.
And he did open it to people who were kind of curious to go in. And just to kind of let you know, because when I had conversations with Francis Nichol when I got out of college, he would always tell me, you know, I could always look inside, but I was never allowed to go in. And I used to smile at him saying, yeah, because you were white, you weren't allowed to go in.
He came from somewhere.
Yeah,
opened the
yeah.
door for
He
us.
later on, he did allow people to go in because he felt it was important for them to understand the history. But he was very cautious about who he talked to and how much information he
What was
was
his
given.
name?
His name is George.
George.
Yes.
Okay, that sounds familiar. Thank you.
Sure.
From where in China did your family come?
We have no idea. All we know is the southern part of China, and that's as far as our father was able to really give us in terms of that. Our father had a lot of, knew a lot of history and had a lot of memory, but he also had a lot on his mind, and because he quit school in 8th grade because our grandfather, his dad, decided he was going to go back to China, and he did, but he didn't take his 10 children with him. He left them here with his wife and just took off and went back. So and I'm sure his intention was never to really die here, but because of that, someone had to go out and earn money to help support the family, and it was my father who did that. The agreement originally was that they each would take a year out of school to go out and support the family, so all of them could complete school. But as we all know, the story doesn't always go that way, and it didn't happen that way. They all graduated but him.
So your grandfather never came back to you?
No, grandfather never came back, never communicated as far as we know in regards to, you know, how the family was doing. And he went, if I'm correct, he went back a year or a few years after our great-grandparents went back to China. So our grandmother was kind of left here with really no support except for Daisy McCallan, who she had worked for. And so that's why she was sort of like left alone and allowed to continue in this community. Yes?
Do you know what dialect do you speak? Do you still speak? Was that passed
No,
down?
we were never taught to speak any dialect because our father really wanted us to assimilate because it was hard enough for him to live here that he knew when we went to school it would even be much more difficult because we were only half Chinese. We weren't necessarily accepted from his brothers and sisters or necessarily from mainstream society. And bless Alma Mendoza's heart, I mean, she was a really tough teacher, but unfortunately, when we went to school, we were kind of labeled as not to be really bright students. And so you kind of working in the dark already of, as Dewey says, having to really prove yourself twice as much as another person. Yes?
I'd like to hear, since Loretta's the eldest and Wes is the youngest, is that right?
No.
Just,
Well, he's next to the youngest.
just both of your views on, because they'll probably be different, about discrimination you felt as a kid or, while you were growing up here. And was it harder for Loretta than it was?
It was harder for me because, like she said, I was the oldest, next to the oldest, and it's hard to talk about it because it was just really hard. You weren't really accepted, and so you had to find your own people, and so mostly my friends were Portuguese, and so I hung around with them quite a bit. It wasn't the white children that I grew up with.
And there were no other Chinese children growing up?
No, and I don't think we would have been accepted either because we were half Chinese and half white. And so anyway, basically, I did finish school, I graduated, then I married, and as time went on, it got better for me. I volunteered quite a bit. I did a lot with the children, and then I started working for the school, and then I got into service organizations and did that. But today, it's quite different. I have a part in this town, and I'm proud to be that part.
Well, when I was growing up, I seen a little bit of it, but I didn't realize it because I was just ignorant to it. And I had a lot of friends, and they were all different, white, Portuguese, and whatever. And not till years later, when I was a lot older, that I found out that my friend told me that that his mom was told by a guy that you shouldn't let your kids play with those kids. They're not the kids to be playing with. And that's when I realized that it's here, and I didn't even realize it. But I started to see it more and more then. But I see less and less of it now. I mean, there's still a little bit. I mean, even my kids get it every once in a while.
Didn't any of that make you want to leave when you grew up?
No, because I loved it here. Everything that I wanted to do was here. Anything that wasn't here, it was only 6 hours away if I wanted to do anything.
Our family was here, and that was our buffer. That was our comfort zone, to have our family to shelter us. Because we were a family, and we did a lot as a family. And I don't know if the younger kids remember that, but we used to go fishing, and we would go with our dad hunting, and we would go to the beach, and we would do all kinds of things, even though we didn't have lots of money to help us with, but like we lived off the land. We had gardens, like most people, and we had a section of town where it was our home. And we basically stayed there, but we did run around town and enjoyed that.
One of the things that I know Loretta remembers, and I still remember, so when I walk by Gallery Books, I kind of flash back, is that there were two grocery stores. There was Bishop's, which was where Gallery Books Fair is, and we did a lot of business there with, Mr. Bishop, and he knew our family really well. And then there was Homer's Market, but we kind of stayed at Bishop's. But what would happen, and I remember when I was like 9 years old, is there were a group of kids who now talk to me but don't remember what they did, but would sit on the corner and constantly would get racist name callings. And it's still, even though you're an adult and you know what it is, it's still scarred. You kind of think back and thinking, don't you remember what you used to do? And that, Wesley may not have gotten it so much, but I remember in high school a couple of times when he played sports, that when you made a mistake or Mervyn made a mistake, then I would hear some racist comments. And especially when I came back from college, it kind of, I remember you didn't hear it, I think Mervyn heard it, and Mervyn was real quiet about it, but I was a little livid about hearing it. And of course, of my education, and I just couldn't do that. And I think that really spurred us on to really make sure that the temple was really protected, because it was something that could educate people in this community, but outside the community, of really what every cultural group has to offer. And especially when you look historically back at Mendocino County's history, if it wasn't for the Chinese labor force, this county would not have existed, or even the state of California. And I always tell in the docent, the abalone that everybody flocks over here to get, if it wasn't for the Chinese introducing that into mainstream society, it would not be such a golden item. Or even in the fishing industry, because everybody talks about the salmon industry and the fishing industry. Really, the Chinese they originated that whole industry, even though historically now you still don't hear that, because they're the ones that discovered the riches in the sea and what could be done with that. Loretta, I want you to talk about, because I always remember this, because I never got any money from this one, is that when I helped you, Leslie, you always went out to play. Remember when we went to pick seaweed?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
And that was like 4 o'clock in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning.
Yes,
And we
Dad
really,
would get us up and he said, oh, this great adventure, we can make some money if you guys would help us. So, since I was next to the oldest, and so I said, oh yeah, Dad, I'll do this. So we get up early in the morning, we hit the low tides, and we would pick seaweed. And my Uncle Bill, well, William they call him, would come up once a week to pick up the seaweed. We had to dry it. We would pick it, we would lay it out in the fields and dry it, and then we lost interest, but Dad would turn the seaweed for us, and then and then we would help him sack it up, and then my uncle would come up, and we would get maybe 25 cents a pound.
I don't even think it was that much.
But anyway, there is documentation in the back. It tells you about the Chinese that did pick seaweed. It tells you about the abalone pickers. I have some pictures back there, and some of the content will tell you some of that. But we did do that, and it didn't last long because it's really hard work to dry it. And you see today it's foggy. And, most of the time, Mendocino, when we were growing up, was either overcast or foggy.
But there was only certain types that you picked, though, because there's a lot of stuff out there. What we picked was sea lettuce, which is light and curly. You'll see it off the rocks. And then now, which is endangered, is the sea palm. And if you're familiar with the sea palm, those are not just offshore. You have to, when it was low tide and we could harvest it, we were really lucky, but we never went out in the boat. 'Cause I don't remember ever our dad taking us out in the ocean.
No.
Always on the rock.
But
It
did
was
you
on
go
the
out
rock.
with?
Yeah, always in the rock.
Yes. And I don't know, Wesley, did you ever go out in the ocean with him, fishing?
No, never had
And
an
it's really
issue.
interesting because he never knew how to swim, and we're always.
And we don't know how to swim. We were never taught. The younger boys did, but.
And Wesley still goes out
Not
in the
me.
ocean.
I still go out though.
What did they use the seaweed for?
Soups and.
Soup and herbal medicines.
Uh-huh.
And we actually he used to use a little bit in his soups, but and that was one of the things growing up here, is we were introduced to some really exotic foods that you couldn't actually get here. And I remember because we had the station wagon, you pile 6 kids in the back, because we always used to get car sick, because the only time our dad was allowed to smoke cigars is when he went to San Francisco. And,
Oh no, on Sundays.
yeah.
Yes.
Oh, I don't
Sunday.
remember. I don't
You
remember
could have a
Sunday.
cigar on Sunday.
And we used to always get sick because he rolled down the window, but all of it would come back to us in the back. So it was always pretty bad. And we would go down like every 6 months to stock up, because rice wasn't something you could just buy at the market here. And we would buy 50 to 100 pound sacks. And I always remember when Loretta was learning how to drive in the clutch. And we still talk about that, because when we go to San Francisco, because we have automatics, and we go say, remember when you have to drive around the block because Dad wouldn't pay for the parking fee? We think if he was alive today, we would give him the money to pay for the parking fee. So, of going down, and what we would do is we'd buy 50 to 100 pound sacks of rice and gallons of soy sauce. And then we would also buy the 100-year-old eggs and the dry shrimp, which Wesley really likes. And then and dried oysters, which you cannot find in the market here. And actually, we were in San Francisco last weekend and said, "Hey, Loretta, here they are." And we look at the price of them, and going, and we only got to use the dried oysters in very special times, and that was a soup that I've tried to duplicate and cannot do. And my father would make it when we were sick, and it was with dried oysters and a butt roast. And a bean curd stick, which you can't buy in the market here, only in San Francisco. And Derek, you had some of that the other day at the vegetarian restaurant, because he was asking me what it was. And it's a special kind of noodle that you have to boil all day for it to become soft. And that was it's the Chinese version of the Jewish chicken soup. So that was and we always looked forward to eating that, even though we were sick. But we look forward to having that soup. But one of the things that really helped us survive with 7 kids, because I don't know if you guys know historically, our father got married really late. He was in his late 40s to our mother, who was his second wife, which I remember. I don't know if Loretta and Wes do, but Mom used to always say, if I knew how old your father was, I would have never married him, because he was in his late 40s and she was 19. And they never discussed age until they signed the marriage certificate. And then she saw how old he was. Because my dad, luckily with the great Asian genes he had, he never looked as old as he was. And so when our dad had, how old is he when he had you?
Oh, I don't know.
He was I think he was in his late 40s.
He's 23 years older than our mother.
Yeah. So when he had Wes and I and Wayne, he was already in his late 50s, and I think Wayne was early 60s.
I think Wayne was 15, he was 15.
Yeah, and actually, unfortunately, our dad did not have a great heart, and so when he was working in a lumber mill, he had to retire when I was in 3rd grade because he had a serious heart attack, and the doctor said he had to retire and then also quit smoking. And so he did quit smoking. He went cold turkey, and then he tried to support us on his retirement of Social Security with 7 children. And we were all still in school. So that's when we learned to live off the land a lot. And the interesting thing is Wes and Merv and Dewey were all taught how to hunt, but the females weren't. Our dad was really traditional in some ways. He didn't tell us directly, but he indirectly told us that there were certain things that we were supposed to do and certain things that our brothers were allowed to do. And so
I did get to go fishing.
Yeah,
I did
I did get to go fishing, but it was boring for me, so
I love fishing.
it was boring. So, but Wesley really loves fishing. I don't know, Elliot, you like fishing?
Sometimes.
Honey?
I don't really go hunting.
And Derek, you used to go hunting with Mervyn, right? No? Fishing?
all.
But Shauna likes fishing, and Shauna used to go fishing a lot with her dad.
Yeah, and I went hunting.
Well, aren't you a better shot?
I am. I'm better than all.
Far out. So, yes.
Again, 30-some years ago when I was here, and they was making this movie, Summer '42. And we used to come in, like I said, I lived in Albion. There's a bunch of us lived on the land. We would come in some weekends, and we used to see Raymond.
Our oldest brother, yes.
At the near the drugstore, where they turned into a movie theater or something, filming that movie. And we talked to him over a period of 3 or 4 years. We saw him often during the early and mid 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And I just found out that his last name was Hee, and I was quite delighted. We used to have quite conversations with him. He was quite a gentleman also.
Yeah, he was kind of like the unofficial mayor, I think, when he was. Oh yeah, sheriff. He used to give out parking tickets, if people remember that. Raymond was the oldest, and unfortunately, they call it mentally challenged now. But at the time when he was growing up and we were growing It was called Mentally Retarded. And I don't think he totally was, because there was interesting with Raymond growing up as a kid. He had a very sharp memory for memorizing things. And like when I would change my earrings, he would tell me I changed my earrings. He had a sense of time, even though he couldn't tell you what time is, he had a sense of time. And that if he was given more time to worked with in the school system, that he would have survived somewhat better than he could. Because even though we tried to teach him, he could write some letters. But because at that time, Mendocino was not an open school district, so he wasn't allowed to, he was at one time allowed to go to Albion, but because someone complained it wasn't an open school district, he wasn't allowed to go there anymore. And so he wasn't allowed to really attend school because they didn't have the patience. And then they had the wonderful thing later when he was in his 20s, Cypress Street Center, which would help them cope with basic living skills and stuff like that. And that's when he seemed to blossom, because he got to meet other friends of his, and it gave him a goal to work for. And yeah, and
my buddy here, he works at Cypress Street, and he told me about the plaque that they have there.
yeah. And it's sad that he's not here anymore, a plaque in honor of Raymond, because Raymond was one of their first students at Cypress Street Center. It's sad that he's not here, but I know in reality, and given the Taoist way, it was better for him not to be here, because he would never have survived Mendocino as it is now. See, because basically when we grew up, everybody knew each other, and as Derek knows, when he went here many years ago, because of our last name, you couldn't get in trouble because everybody would tell on you. They would come back to you. So, and so we knew that Raymond was really taken care of, because people would look out for him, just as well as they looked out for Elliot and them growing up and making sure he stays in line. So that's how small the community is. But now the community has changed it's very different than what it was. And so he would not have been able to sit in front of the shops or, walk around town and talk to people, because I think a lot of people would not have had the understanding or the tolerance for that.
Wow. Well, I'm sure glad I met him.
Yeah, he was a pretty open guy, pretty
Sure
giving.
was.
One thing about Raymond though, you could tell him his name. 10 years later, he'd remember your name. He'd know who you were,
Oh, yeah.
which I wish I could do.
Oh, yeah, he was cogent. I enjoyed talking to him. Oh,
And he was a great big brother, because if somebody was picking on us and he was around, look out, because he would come after them. So he was a great protector.
What is the altar, if that's what you'd call it, in the back of the room?
Yeah, that is an altar, and Loretta actually, someone who called us up and told us that it was in the Humane Society, so Loretta went to purchase it. But it's a small altar, and most houses have some kind of altar, maybe even more elaborate, that are in their room somewhere where they have the god. And the god that you see back there is actually Quan Dai. It's a plastic version of him, and that is the god that we have in the temple. One of the things that Quan Dai symbolizes that has been selected for our temple, because every Chinese temple that's in California, there are 5 still left, each of them have a different god, and they're selected specifically for a purpose. And ours, Quan Dai is known as the god of war, but really what he's known is for the god of loyalty. And we suspect that when our great-grandfather sailed over to here, he prayed to Quan Dai to bring him here over safely. And since he got here safely, that was, in reverence to him, he's been named. Because technically, when we went to Taiwan, they were saying, why don't you have the goddess of Matsu? And we're like looking at them and going, what's that? She's the goddess of the sea. And it would be logical because we're right by the ocean. But we said, no, it's always been Quan Dai. And then things started to fall into place in terms of what he really means. And one of the things that we were brought up with is that even though we grew up in a very interesting community, and as we all know, it had changed from the 20s to the 30s to the 70s, whatever, and that we always, as Loretta said, we always had a base. We always had our father, who is really and mother, who are really the rock of our nucleus, and we're brought up to believe that and to always be there as the nucleus. So, and that's what really made it really easy to survive, even though we were told to raise our head high and walk on. So, but if our dad was alive today, I think he'd be really proud. And it would be a different world for him, a very different world for him. And I think he would be a lot more open. Because Wes, remember when you used to have friends, their dad would always tell you who was acceptable as a friend and who wasn't? Because our dad was really cautious about people as well. And that it was really interesting because when there were Chinese that came up from the city, he was always very open and very talkative with them. And then with other people in the community, he would be very closed. And so he was always very cautious too as well, throughout the years of, who he would open up to and who
And he spoke Chinese to him, which he always told us, I don't know how to speak it.
But, he spoke a really old dialect too, because when I went to graduate school and I worked for a Chinese restaurant, and they came like my second family, when I went to do to go up to the college to do something for my master's, I brought him along so he could meet this family because they wanted to meet him. And when they sat down to eat lunch, and the lady whose name was Shampoo, one of the ladies sat down and started to eat with him and talk to him, and she always goes like this, I always remember it as that. And they said a couple of words, and then she walked off and left him, and I came back and I go, what happened? He goes, I can't speak to her because she speaks a different dialect. She was an immigrant from Hong Kong, which is the dialect that a lot of people are now speaking when they come from China or Mandarin, and he could not converse with them. And the dialect that we have now, as we discovered in Taiwan, they call it the ancient language. So that's one, and since I only know some bad words, and I learned, I was taught those. And graduate school, when I was doing some research on a Chinese American radio station, they were using them, and I asked them, what are those? And then they told me, I go, isn't that a violation of the FCC's regulations? They go, yeah, but they don't know what it means, so. So I just kind of smiled.
When did your mom pass away, or was quite a while after you did?
1990,
90,
Oh, really?
2 years after Raymond.
Oh,
just before Elliot was born.
Did they ever share with you stories of how difficult, beyond having to go 2 states away to get married, how difficult it was for them? I assume they married in their early 40s, it says.
Yeah.
And then coming back and living in this community.
Loretta can answer that. I really can't.
I don't remember them ever telling us anything about it, but we just knew that it was different. And they just survived,
They didn't have a social group, they were.
They had a
definitely
few. They had a few. They had the bars that my dad worked with, and Uncle. He had his brother, Uncle Charlie, and then he had his brother, the other ones that came up from the city. So there's no living from my father's side living. Our aunt died about 4 weeks ago. She was the last of the Hees. And he did talk to Miles Paoli a little bit, but that was the most socialization that we've ever really seen our father do with people. He was very close.
Well, he was social with the fishermen down
Yeah.
when we went fishing. He knew a lot.
The fish stories.
Yeah, well, he fished with them and stuff. But it was kind of funny when I was a kid that when he had extra, he always gave them to people around the block. And
Shared.
But for some reason, a lot of people didn't share with us. I don't know. I always thought it was kind of odd when I was a kid.
Especially the surfish, because we used to get lots of surfish.
Yeah.
Yes.
Did you always live in the little house next to the temple?
Yes. Yeah,
All of
it's a
us.
small house, but we weren't like most children. We were always outside.
Yeah.
And we weren't a typical family, like all sitting down together and eating at once. I think our mother got really frustrated because we would just come and go in stages.
If you weren't
But-
there,
Yeah.
you're on your own.
You're tough out loud. But something, in some ways, I guess they're pretty lucky we turned out okay. Because they really never gave us any rules. We didn't have curfews of what time to be home or whatever. The only thing that was really made known to us that we were not allowed to drink, my mother was really an avid yeah, and she actually used to get violently angry if she found out we were drinking. And the other thing that we also didn't know, I mean, we kind of knew, but we were never told, and I don't know how, and I'm still trying to figure this out. We always knew that we were never to embarrass our father or to make him look bad. And so one of the things that we never did is we never cut school, except from Wayne. And Wayne got like 8 lectures, not from his father or mother, but from his brothers and sisters. And we just knew that we weren't supposed to do that. And I don't know how we knew that, but we just never did. we had a lot of respect for him. And maybe because he was much older than we had as a typical father, because when Wesley was in high school and he was already in his 60s. And so he couldn't do a lot with us, like play ball, even though our father loved baseball and actually passed that love on to Wesley. And I guess you inherited, Elliot. Because our father, no matter how bad the Giants were doing, he always listened to the Giants. Come rain, snow, or whatever, he was always listening to the Giants. And he would actually, the enjoyment he would get was go up and watch Wesley play baseball. He would sit in the car and watch him play, Mervyn play baseball. And actually went to watch them play football as well. But baseball was his first love, and that's what he enjoyed doing. And so he talked about that. We've heard stories that our dad was, well, from our mother, he was an avid gambler. And that's why we didn't have a lot of money when we were younger.
He also had a pool hall in the Kelley-on Hall, and that's where he also had a grocery store too. And his brothers and sisters had helped him with that. And we don't know whatever happened to that store, but then he worked for Joe Quell, and then he went to work for Philbrick's Mill in Tomshee. So that's where he last worked. But he was all over the place.
I got a great picture of your dad at Caspar.
Yeah, he worked at Caspar for a while.
Panoramic that I think your old Sylvie gave.
You need to get this.
I need to get that.
Yes.
What about, you said that you had to live off the land, so to speak. What about meals and things? Because your mother was not Chinese, correct? And
Yeah.
so did she learn, how did she learn to cook Chinese?
She didn't.
She didn't. So
No, there was always, as we say, a war in the kitchen.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because she thought the kitchen was her domain. Our mom wasn't really neat. Our dad was very fastidious. And she kind of, I think there was a little jealousy because he was a better cook than she was. And he would do a lot of Chinese dishes for us. And one of the ones that we now know is called congee, which we have turkey rice soup to us. And people would say, hey, congee, oh, you mean turkey rice soup? We had that a lot. But one of the things that was interesting with our family is my mother was a meat and potato person, and she would always burn the meat. It was always well done. That's how she knew how to cook. But we always had rice. It was already interesting. At Thanksgiving dinner, we had the traditional turkey and the potatoes, but we always had rice. And we didn't dispute that because we never ate the rice at turkey dinner. What we did as kids is in the morning we would fight over the rice because then we could have turkey fried rice for breakfast. And so whoever got up first is the one that got the rice to make the breakfast for their turkey fried rice. And so we always had rice with every meal, even at Christmas time. And at Christmas time, if you remember, we used to sneak in the closet because our aunt and uncles would send us up the preserved fruits, but also raw candy and some of the other Chinese candy. And that was kind of like we had an Asian Christmas. And so that was really the best part of our Christmas is that we had Christianity, but we also had these other unusual treats. And one of the things that we still like is you guys know it as dim sum, but we knew it as bao and sumai. And when we were younger, our dad used to, when we went to San Francisco, we always stopped at the bakery and bought bao. And we would consume about half of it cold on the way home because we didn't get car sick on the way back, which is interesting. And we would have some, and then we would get to take some to school for lunch, and kids would kind of look at us a little weird, and we go, oh, it's just a Chinese hamburger.
Wow, I like that.
Any other questions? Yes, Maureen.
Earlier on, Lorraine, you mentioned that your grandmother worked for Daisy McCallum. Could you tell us a little bit more about that relationship?
Oh, I really don't know. Loretta might have a little more information about that. I really don't know. All our father had said that she had befriended Daisy McCallum, and that's all he would tell us about that. Unfortunately, if Francis Nichol was alive, he might be able to would have given us a little more insight to that because he was young then to do that. But I really don't have any information to that. I mean, I have some memories of my mom talking about when I asked her when I was a little girl, I said, because you're white and you married into a Chinese family, I wondered how our grandmother treated her, because she wasn't Chinese, because I know my aunts and my aunts especially were not welcoming to us because we were only half, and they were always very, kind of looked at us and always spoke Cantonese in front of us, and which I always thought was a little strange because they knew we weren't bilingual, so it was perfect for them. So I always wondered how they would treat our mother, because I always, when we went to family functions, they would always speak Cantonese in front of her, and so she was kind of left out. And so I always wondered how she was treated by my grandmother, because my grandmother had died a few months before I was born. But Loretta, you should remember, because Grandma was alive when you were
Well, she
a
was
girl.
gone off and on to Anita's place in Arizona, Tucson, Arizona. She spent a lot of time there, but when she was back, I used to go down, and she had gotten sick, and I used to help her dress. And at that time, she wasn't working, so I don't know anything about the Daisy McCollum, what she had done for her, but I assume it was general housekeeping. My grandmother took in washing and did a lot of washing. And then she would visit her friends to the lower part of town. That I used to go with her to Mrs. Vieira's on the corner of Main, and I can't remember what the alley is. There's no alley, but it's a street, but it's right there where the jewelry store is on the corner down there by Lampmeyer's.
That was, didn't the Vieira's they had all the chicken coops, that's where we
Yeah.
bought our fresh chicken eggs at all the time. And Mrs. Vieira's husband in the morning, I remember as a little girl, well, after it rained, he was always out and was wondering what he was doing. He was picking snails because he would eat them.
It was coffee canes.
Yeah, remember that? But I was
Fill out
like,
with
oh, they
snails.
were disgusting. But I would help him pick them because I thought, great, somebody else is going to eat these ugly things. So, yeah, and that was, he was the only person I knew that did that, was pick those snails. Boy, wouldn't he have a heyday now? He can come to my yard. But he would eat those, and it was kind of interesting. And then there was a couple other characters in town. Dee.
I had the pleasure of teaching all of you.
Yes. Maybe a pleasure or not a pleasure.
And another thing, you know, a lot of fond memories of Raymond, because Raymond spent a lot of time at the high school. And he knew all the kids up there, and they all knew him. And even though he wasn't going to school, he was there and taking part in everything. And we always said that Raymond could hear a movie starting in any classroom, and he would be there. He watched every movie shown.
That's interesting, 'cause I don't remember that.
Mhm.
Oh.
He always knew when there was a movie going on.
Huh.
And so he would be there, and he loved it. And he sat through everybody's movies.
Yeah, those are probably the only time he really was quiet and not talking, right?
Were any of you in extra and in the movies that was filmed here in Mendocino?
Never. No.
I did a little bit, not much.
Which one?
Summer 42.
Oh, you were. I probably saw you. Now I have
Very little part.
Yeah, that was 30-some years ago, 35 years ago. Wow.
Are there any other questions? Yes.
Did your mom die in the home that you grew
No.
up in?
She actually died, unfortunately, in a nursing home because she had to be near a dialysis machine, and at that time, even now today, there was not a dialysis machine that was close enough.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing about our mom is that she could have continued on the dialysis machine, but she made the decision to take herself off the machine, and so it was her choice of when she chose to leave this earth.
Is it true the Chinese community had a farm across the bridge?
Yes, it is.
I think your dad is the one that told me that.
Yeah, our dad did, and it's interesting that 10 years ago, a state archaeologist was doing some research, and I guess it was when they were starting to think about a light over there on that property, so he was doing some research, and he had called me up and said, I hear you have a story, and I go, what story? And so he said, you know that there were gardens there, and I go, yeah, according to the oral history of my father, and he said, well, I want to tell you it's true, because we found the shed, and we found some garden tools. So,
Unbelievable.
yeah, there's across Big
Stanford.
River, where Stanford is, about that whole strip there. The highway splits it now, but it was on the coast side as well.
And there's still 2 apple trees, 2 very, very old apple trees.
Wow, yeah, your dad told me that.
Yeah.
When I saw it a long time ago.
And even if you go down to the headlands, the Chinatown was there, you see kale there. And I know that the state parks, wants to dig that up. But historically, those are remnants. Those are from seedlings from the original kale that the Chinese, they had gardens in the front, in back of their little shacks, that part of their gardens to survive.
That's those little houses across the street from the temple?
No, it was actually on the headlands. There's nothing there at this point. There's berry briars and grass. But that's where Chinatown was, and Chinatown looked up where the temple is. You could see the temple very clearly from there. There's questions in the back. Megan.
So when did the other Chinese leave, and why did they leave, or why did your family stay?
Our father said that they started to leave when the mills started dying down because the timber wasn't kind of what we're doing now. And also when the Depression came, even more so, they migrated wherever the jobs were, and that's what their intention is. Wherever the industry was really booming, that's where they were going to make their money, and they moved as the jobs required them to do so. And the only reason our family stayed here is because of our grandmother and all the children. They just couldn't get up and go somewhere else and make a new life because they didn't really have any other connections to anybody to help support them. And so it was, and the family home was owned and paid for down on Main Street, which is, I don't know, shops change here so drastically.
It's the Raymond's house, it's right behind.
Yeah, and that, that property was paid for, so she didn't have a mortgage.
Oh, that was your grandmother?
Yeah, the grandmother. Well, actually, our father bought it, and when he got his first divorce, Loretta said she doesn't know what happened to the business. He told me, because I found out our father was married before, because he never really told us, and I had found that out, and I go, what, you were married before? And he goes, yeah, related to the bishops. And I said, well, why did you divorce? And he goes, she was horrible. He liquidated, I won't repeat what he actually said, he liquidated all his assets before he got his divorce, because he knew he didn't want her to have anything. And at the time, he owned the sundry shop and the family property, and he liquidated the business and put the family home under his mother's name to protect that. And then years later, he married my mother.
Did they have any children?
No, he didn't marry her stayed married long enough for her to have children. Yes?
I have heard that at one point there was a Chinese laundry on the south side of Main Street across from what is now, well, it used to be the Bank of America. Out of this world, I think it might be called.
Oh,
Is that true?
I've never heard that. I heard there was a school across the Bank of America that burnt down.
Butcher shop.
Yeah. And that when it burnt down, then because the Chinese did have separate schools and went to separate schools, and when that school went down, then our aunts and uncles got to go to mainstream school.
Was that a public school?
Yeah.
The Chinese school was financed?
I don't know. There was really never anything said about how it's financed. I suspect that the Chinese community supported it. Because historically, one of the things that I also remember Beth saying, well, there wasn't a lot of Chinese here. But Francis Nichols had, when his relatives had the beacon, he had put on this metal tin and always meaning to go shoot it. But it's in the 1880s or 70s, it's a Sanborn insurance map. And it maps out all the businesses and the temples on there, but also these Chinese herb shops. And there's like 5 to 7 of them, and I looked at him, I said, for this many herb shops, there had to be some population to, for these guys to stay in business. So he kind of looked at me and thought, yeah, you got a point. So that's what really confirmed my father's oral history being pretty right on. Yes?
Were there any clan associations, benevolence associations? Who was here, the 6 companies?
Not here, but Loretta knows, well, Loretta, you might remember, it's Uncle Bill, isn't it?
Yeah.
Uncle Bill belonged to a benevolent association in San Francisco, which we suspect really was a Tong, because the thing is that my dad didn't talk to him a whole lot, but there's a story in the Beacon that I can't even remember when it was going back, but I remember it saying, my Aunt Mildred, who was the youngest, someone had given her alcohol and she was a minor, and they talked about some Chinese coming up from San Francisco with Bill. They mentioned him, and that they had some words, the gentleman that provided her with alcohol, and they said it was part of the 6 companies, but I'm sure it was to physically, not physically, because there was no physical harm, but to really warn them off that never to do it again. So we suspected I suspected that, you know, our Uncle Bill did belong to a Tong.
A Tong is a gang?
Yeah, the Chinese, they're protective, kind of an association that kind of looked out for each other. And if someone was, it's like the Latin Mafia, but they never called it that. Yes, way in the back. Oh, it's
You know,
George.
a friend of mine in Philadelphia, his name's Joel Holmes, and his mother was real active in the historical society. Anyway, he, and I'm sure you already know this, but you didn't mention it, so I'll mention it. Anyway, he said his grandfather came to Fort Bragg because and there was a job to be a supervisor for the Chinese who were building the railroads for the Union Lumber Company. And I would just suspect, if you look at some of these road cuts that are here and there all over the place, here around this area, that they were probably built with Chinese labor. And, you know, that would explain why all the herb shops, I mean, these people had to go and, you know, buy stuff. But in conjunction with that, it was Chinese labor that built the railroad.
Yes.
You know, and that was, you know, Crocker was the one that was instrumental in bringing those people in because there was just no other labor available, even though there was a lot of protest about it.
Well, except the reason is because there were a lot of protests about it, because Crocker had brought them also in as indentured servants. And so the agreement was that if any of them got killed, their bodies physically had to be shipped back to China. So they were great. They ended up working for very little money because they had to pay Crocker and all the people they were indentured to all this money back. But the interesting thing about that, George, is a lot of people don't realize dynamite was available, but the Chinese were never allowed to handle the dynamite. And that's why in the skunk train, you know, the tunnels out there, they were hand dug by the Chinese there because they were scared they were going to get killed by using the dynamite, so they didn't allow them. And that meant you know, the owner would lose money because he would have to ship this body back. But yeah, you're right. They were a major source of labor, and yeah, there was definitely a lot of protest of that, especially Kearneyman's Working Men Union, who actually did come up from San Francisco here to ward off employers in Albion from hiring Chinese persons. They actually did travel up here to threaten them about that. But that strife was actually here too as well, yeah. But it's interesting, George, you hear that same argument now in 2006 with the Hispanics.
Yeah, but it was actually the history of, in terms of the 20th century, that the Chinese was a little more intense. I mean, they took the one on San Francisco, and you know all about that. But
yeah.
Just, to me, it was interesting because it was an established thing. The Chinese labor is what was used for building railroads, and we don't just appreciate how much railroad was built in this area. And that's what, like I said, Joel Holmes' grandfather, that's what he did. He came here specifically to manage.
Did he befriend any of them?
You know, you'd have to talk to
Joe. I guess
Joel's mother was very active in history writing and all that stuff.
Uh-huh.
So they might very well have some stuff written down on all that.
Okay.
As far as, you know, what happened and this, that, and the other thing.
All right. There were some other questions back I thought I saw. Yes.
I just want to know, I know the pressures to assimilate when you were growing up, but were there any New Year's celebrations, like in your home, or?
Yeah, a lot. Even though we did assimilate in a lot of ways, but in terms of New Year's, that was definitely not one that my father did not give up. And we did do some practice in the temple. And one of the ritual is that actually it's off of where, I don't know what the mill, LP used to be. We used to drive up there because when the Vieiras weren't here anymore, there was another chicken farm where we get our fresh chickens. And organic too, Shauna. And we would also get a fresh chicken. And on New Year's, my mother was actually pretty good sport about it. Is that they would get a fresh chicken and they would kill it that day, and we would all disappear. We wouldn't help. We were bad kids about that, but if anybody's ever killed a fresh chicken and taken the feathers off, it's really disgusting. And then also it's just kind of, it was just hard to watch. And they would actually get this fresh chicken and they would boil it, and then we would do some other dishes. I can't remember what some of the other dishes were. And then we would do all this, my dad would do all of this cooking, my mother would help, and then we would take it to the temple.
The fresh fruit.
Yeah, the fresh fruit and lots of candy.
Nuts.
Yeah, but no alcohol, even though we give the Fong
It was-
alcohol now.
Yeah, it's tea.
And what we would do is we would have to help them carry all these dishes in, and we would light the incense, and then have, you know, my father, I don't remember if he said any blessings or not, but we
Take that
also,
paper.
yeah, the money
The
paper.
paper and light it on fire and put it in the
Right.
stove.
We, you see some in the back, the gold and the silver was money paper. Our dad always took a few of those and lit those, and the stove that's there now, we would put the money paper in there and let it burn. And we didn't really told why, but we know now it's to make sure that we're financially taken care of in the year. But we also found out that you're supposed to burn big stacks of it. So, and so that might explain why we were sort of frivolous in regards to that. But that's part of it. And then what we would do is leave some food for him, and then we would take the other food back and then eat that. And that was kind of like the only time we all sat down and ate was on Chinese New Year's, was all the food that was prepared for us. And then we would make sure that the Quan Dai had some tea and some rice, and then a little bit of the boiled chicken, and then lots of fresh fruit and coconut candy and the preserved plums. We had all of that. We left that for him. And my father would, we don't leave it in there, but he would always leave the citrus in there until it kind of molded. And we change it out on the 1st and the 15th because we found out that's what you're really supposed to do. And so he would leave that there all year as the food for the gods. But we didn't light off the firecrackers. They did that historically in the 1800s when they were here, in the 1900s, but we did, because firecrackers are illegal now here, but they would shoot them off. They would have a huge celebration, and the Beacon was very vocal, letting the community know about those celebrations, because they would always say it was the noisy celestials. Be prepared, the noisy celestials are going to make noise again. So, and we, yeah, it's a lot of that.
And how about the lantern festival?
I don't remember our dad ever talking about that. And I don't know if Loretta remembers, like today, not today, but yesterday was the Moon Festival in Chinatown. And it's called the Changing of the Seasons from Summer to Fall. They call it the Moon Festival. And they'll have a Lantern Festival in February because Chinese New Year's is on the 18th of this year. So they will do something probably a week before to celebrate that. But we never really
Did that.
Dad really never got into a lot of that with us. I think he thought it was a great feat just for us to remember our basic history, let alone to trap us and get us to stay in one place and learn all the other traditional customs that we were supposed to do. Besides, our mother was pretty rebellious about what her role should be, so. Mm-hmm.
Did your family found the temple? Was it your great-grandfather who founded it?
Our great-grandfather found the temple.
Really?
Yes.
As a family temple, as a...
No, as a community temple. And what it was is that it was caretakers, and it was passed down from generation to generation. And what happened is before he left, he had his daughter promise that she would take care of it forever. And she made my dad make that promise, and then we made that same promise. And hopefully this generation will make the same promise as well. I assume it has, even though we're a nonprofit corporation now, and it's working on the 5th generation that will carry that on.
Was your mother's family, was she a local girl?
They were from Laytonville. And we don't really know how my father met her, but I assume she was over here with her sister visiting the coast.
So did you know your maternal grandparents?
I did. The younger ones didn't because they had passed away. My grandmother was quite sick with diabetes, and at that time she was administering her insulin herself, and sometimes you don't know how much you're doing, and so she sort of overdosed on her insulin. But they lived in Caspar.
Oh. So you had there was a real 2-branch family, and your mother's family got along with your father's?
Well, I don't know, I don't remember them ever mixing together. It was, I think, there and Mendocino.
One of the things I remember about our mother talking about is our mother was never really raised by her mother because her mother got married many times. And so my mother, because there was an uncle in Ukiah that she lived with for some time, and he told me that because her mother was married, was always sort of remarrying, that she was really shipped out to a lot of her relatives to be raised. And that's kind of by a roundabout way coming here, it's how she met her dad. And it was also down Portuguese Flat where he met her.
Mhm.
So, again, that side of town. So, but we really, yeah, I mean, my mother didn't really talk about her mother, and even her brothers and sisters, they were really fractionalized, and the only one that we knew that she kept in contact was her sister Marge, who had green eyes and black hair. This is it. So
And dark skin.
And we always asked her, you know, our mother's really fair-skinned, bright, and has greenish eyes too, and Marge was really tall, my mother was really short, and we go, look, you sure you guys are sisters? Because we asked if they had the same dad, they did, but she goes, I'm the Black Irish. She would always tell us. So, and she's actually still alive.
Yeah, and she had married a Portuguese gentleman on the Portuguese Flat. It was Henry Silveira. Can't remember what his first name is, but so she was around here too for a while until her husband was killed. Then she left with their children.
Any other questions? You're all questioned out.
Well, we want to thank you very much for sharing the information with us.